Like most things that survive into their 90s, the Boise Airport has gone through several changes over the years. Today marks the travel hub's 97th birthday, from when it was first located on the current campus of Boise State to the groundbreaking out by Gowen Field. That happened in the late 1930s. They were going for a futuristic look back in the redesigned planning days of the 1960s. Take a look at it there, and they kind of nailed it, as you see what it looked like in 1975 with the kind of berms there. Yeah. You know, it didn't look like that when I moved here back in the late 1990s, and it got another complete makeover a few years after that. But what about the days before the Boise Airport existed? Well, we find out about that in today's 208 Redial. In 1903, getting from point A to point B suddenly got more interesting, thanks to the Wright brothers. If people could get around by plane, well, so could their stuff, like a lightweight letter. About 15 years after that first flight, the idea of delivering mail by air started bouncing around what was then called the U.S. Post Office Department.
By 1918, the U.S. Post Office Department had convinced Congress to appropriate some funds to try to test some of these ideas to even see if it was possible.
It was, with some help.
Because the Post Office Department, of course, didn't own planes and they didn't employ pilots. They employed mail carriers. Cue
the Kelly Act. In 1925, Congress allowed the U.S. Post Office to contract with commercial pilots to carry the mail. So that settled the who. What about the how? Well, they didn't have to start from scratch.
They looked across the country and they were really hoping to build on a transcontinental route that the U.S. Army had helped develop between 1918 and 1925.
One of those routes?
From Pasco, Washington to Elko, Nevada.
With a stopover in Boise. But who would run that route?
There was an individual who had been very instrumental in building the aviation industry, and his name was Walter Varney.
Varney, a World War I vet, owned and operated a flight school, so he had access to pilots. Pilots like Leon Cuddyback. Remember that name, not that it isn't memorable.
But in Boise, we didn't have an airstrip in 1925.
Varney also had access to land, buying a flat piece of property south of the Boise River.
And although it had trees and some brush, they were able to clear that acreage and build an airstrip.
Back to Cuddyback. On April 6, 1926, he headed to Elko, taking off from Pasco in a single-engine plane with just one bag of mail. An overland trip that would normally take 49 hours.
They departed at 6 a.m., and it took him about 4 hours to make it to Boise.
Cuddyback touched down to fanfare, but he didn't stay on the ground for long. He picked up Boise's bundle and took off for Elko. Once there, Franklin Rose, another Varney pilot, was waiting to return along the same route.
He unfortunately encounters some very bad weather, is blown about 75 miles off course, and he has to crash land in southwestern Idaho in a grain field.
Rose survived, and so did the mailbag.
Ultimately, Rose ended up walking with mail, carrying some of it by horseback, and then ultimately driving it back into Boise so that it could then be put on a plane and that route could be continued to Pasco.
A turbulent start for sure to the Boise Spur, but they didn't stay grounded for long. And the airstrip started seeing more than just airmail. Like when 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh landed the Spirit of St. Louis at Varney's Airport as part of a 48-state tour in September 1927. Then came the commercial concept, and Varney began flying people around the West.
Varney ended up building a hangar and adding additional buildings to the site.
By 1930, Varney Airlines was sold to United Airlines. Yeah, that United Airlines. Meanwhile, Boise was growing, and so was its first Institute of Higher Learning.
So Boise Junior College had been leasing space on the north side of the river, and when this opportunity arose, they relocated to the South Bank and built their first administrative building and added some dormitories and classrooms over time. And so eventually the use of that airstrip, it ceased. And so in 1936, thereabouts, the decision was made to officially relocate the Boise Airport to Gowen Field.
But the original airfield was still on school grounds. That is, until Boise Junior College needed to build a football field. And one could say the Broncos took control of the airspace after that. By the way, when the airport moved to Gowen Field in 1938, it had the longest runway in the U.S. at the time at 8,800 feet. One of Arnie's original hangars was also moved to the new location, and it was there until those major renovations that we were talking about were made to Boise's airport in 2003. Boise Airport said last year they had 4.5 million passengers come through, and they're expected and excited to continue to serve as the Treasure Valley's gateway to adventure.